People can say to you over and over again, it's not your fault, but that's not going to do anything to change the way you feel and think. You've got to figure that out or gradually come to that conclusion.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Or if this is your first time joining in, thank you for being with us. This podcast is a safe space for victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault to share their stories and connect with others who've been through similar experiences. I believe that sharing our stories is the first step to healing, and my hope is that the SAS podcast will help victims and survivors feel less alone and more empowered. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Pod Vlog studio in St. George, Utah, and I'm here each week to provide a platform for victims and survivors to tell their story and for experts and professionals to offer insights and information to help us all on our healing path and to provide an education on being trauma-informed in order to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape or sexual assault. If you are a victim, survivor, or know someone who is, or if you investigate or prosecute rape or sexual assault cases, or if you provide treatment, counseling, or interact with victims or survivors of rape or sexual assault in any capacity, I urge you to listen to this podcast. Remember, you are not alone, and we are all here to support you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me for episode 37 of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Several weeks ago, I introduced you to a very good friend of mine, Alan Manwaring. Alan is the executive director of the Jan Broberg Foundation, and he is also a survivor of childhood sexual assault. Besides being my friend and a colleague on the foundation, we share that experience of being survivors of childhood sexual assault. In episode 26, Alan and I started an in-depth conversation of what it means to be on the survivor path. Today, we continue that dialogue. It's a meaningful and powerful discussion, and I'll just leave it at that and let you listen in. I think you'll find it informational and helpful, and I'll catch you on the other side. Here's Alan. Alan Manwaring, it's great to have you back on the SAS podcast. How are you?
Good. We're doing pretty well.
Yeah.
It's always really cool to be here.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege and honor to have you back. Alan, I'm just going to kind of open this up to wherever you'd like to go.
We sort of left off last time, I think, in terms of talking about the journey and I think where we were talking about the things that I had sort of discovered in putting a lot of dots together through my group therapy and through my individual therapy as well.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think we ended with, was we had sort of ended with the concept of how I had sort of come to the conclusion that for me at that time, early in my journey, I was defining healing as having your intellectual understanding and your emotional understanding of the fact that it's not your fault get closer and closer and closer. Because if there's one thing I really learned about both my own feelings and those of the people around me all the time in my group therapy, it was that we all felt shame and guilt, and many of us felt like we were partially complicit in the process. Many of us felt like, how could we be so stupid to have been duped into these things that occurred? And I think that one of the things that I saw as a real reoccurring theme in the feelings of everyone who'd gone through these experiences as a kid was this sort of feeling of like, it's my fault. I could have stopped this. Then when people would always continue to say, hey, look, you were 11 years old, well, in my case, or in other people's cases, you were like 5 or 6 years old, or you were whatever. It's like, so of course it's not your fault. And I think that one of the things that I had sort of come to the conclusion of early in my journey was the concept that healing, in a large part, would be having that intellectual understanding that it's not your fault, sort of come together with your emotional feeling that it's not your fault, because that's really, there's always a big gap between those things. And I think that a lot of people who experience the things that we did as kids have that feeling that it's their fault, which causes a lot of difficulty. I think that's sort of where we'd sort of left off a little bit in terms of the last episode. I think that maybe what we could talk about right now, and continuing with that sort of theme of the journey, is that after my first year or so, and again, I started really this journey about 7 years ago now, and I've been with the same men's healing group over that last 7 years. There have been different other participants that have come in and out of that process over that time, but I've got a really good core group of guys who are really great support in this process. And so the other things that I think have occurred over time is that I have come closer in that understanding, that intellectual and that emotional understanding of the fact that it's not my fault. I've come to a lot more understanding of the grooming process and how that works, and how when you're as young as you are, when you're 11 and 12 years old, or even younger in many other people's cases, that there's a lot of grooming that occurs that your mind just doesn't really understand a lot of things when you're that age. And so that's really helped tremendously in terms of getting that understanding that it's not your fault. I think I've also added some things to what I would consider to be important parts of healing, an understanding that part of healing for me needs to be a closer relationship of sex and intimacy, and that sex and intimacy need to come together and to be the same thing.
For sure.
As opposed to being so different in terms of, I think one of the things that happens when you have these experiences as a kid is you just sort of completely dissociate sex with intimacy, because sex was such a different thing at that time of your development. And so it doesn't really make sense in terms of intimacy. And I think there's a lot of work that has to be done in anyone's journey of healing to sort of bring those things together and have an understanding of those things. There's a lot of other things I think that I've progressed on in my journey as well, but that's one of the things I think has been real key.
For me, and sitting here listening to you talk, I go back to some of my own emotional responses to the intellectual input that comes from other people saying, well, no, you shouldn't feel guilty. You shouldn't feel shame. You were 11, or in my case, I was much younger. And like you said, the intellect says, well, yeah, I guess I shouldn't, but that's not helping me much.
Right.
When you tell me not to feel what I'm feeling, I can't just say, oh, well, because I was 6, or in your case, because I was 11, poof. Okay, the shame is gone, the guilt is gone because you said I shouldn't feel that way.
Right.
So it's not real helpful. It's a long journey of healing to get from the intellect of I shouldn't feel that way, because the other people are right. I was only 6 in my case for the early part of it, 11 in your case that lasted for a year. So age is a big part of understanding and relationships and emotion versus intellect. But now that I'm an adult and I look back, somebody telling me, well, you don't need to take on that shame, you don't need to take on that guilt, or you're being too hard on yourself.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it does sound kind of harsh too from that aspect, but it also sounds harsh to me when somebody else says, you should feel this, and I can't.
Right. I totally get that. And in fact, I think it's a fantastic point, because that is exactly the way it is. I mean, people can say to you over and over again, it's not your fault, but that's not going to do anything to change the way you feel and think. You've got to figure that out or gradually come to that conclusion. This reminds me of my favorite movie is Good Will Hunting, because there's a scene toward the end where Robin Williams is saying to Matt Damon, it's not your fault. And Matt Damon says, I know. And Robin Williams says, no, you don't. It's not your fault. And Matt Damon says, I know. And Robin Williams goes back again. It's not your fault. I know. He goes back over and over again and says, it's not your fault. You understand that. It's not your fault. And finally, Matt Damon sort of breaks down and sort of starts feeling maybe that's the case. Because some people can tell you over and over again, it's not your fault. And until you can really internalize that from whatever work you need to do on coming to that conclusion through therapy, it's not going to have an effect.
Yeah.
And I totally get that. In fact, that's a great point, because I can tell you from my experience that people at the beginning of the process would say that to me over and over again and say, well, I just don't feel that way. And that reminds me of the fact that I think I might have mentioned, at least in some of the podcasts we've been doing. I think I'd said to my therapist, who are 2.5 or 3 years into the process, this actually works. I can actually feel a difference. But it took me 2.5 to 3 years to actually feel that there was some, that there's some validity to therapy, and that actually it really sort of does work. It has, an effect. And one of her responses was, yeah, but it takes a lot of work, and you put the work into it. And so what you're saying is spot on, because it takes a lot of work to be able to internalize and understand and feel that it's not your fault.
We've talked about this on Jan's episode with you and me. Those neuropaths that are ingrained when we're being assaulted, and our emotional and physical disconnect that you talked about, and how that impacts us for the rest of our lives, really. Those neuropaths don't just change because somebody tells you should change them, as we've just said, but building new neuropaths between that limbic system, that emotional part of us, and the intellect can take quite a bit of time, as in your case, 2 to 3 years of ongoing work. And therapy. But a lot of people are not patient with that, or don't have access to that kind of therapy, can't afford it, or they're living in a rural location where that's just not available. And so I think that's kind of the place where I'm at with this whole podcast idea, and having people reach out to me that want to be on the show, and talking to people that I know have been through sexual assault or rape, that talking about it is the start. It's maybe not the absolute number one step, but I think it's very early on in the healing process.
Oh, I think that's absolutely one of the first steps in the process. And I think what you're saying is, again, spot on. From my experience, being able to talk about it at the beginning, in terms of just talking about it, I had spent 40 years of not saying a word, or at least maybe telling less than a handful of people. Finally, seeing that other people had a somewhat shared experience, to get to that place where I can begin to understand that maybe it isn't my fault, because these things happen to other people as well. I think one of the things that I always felt was that, how in the world could I have been so stupid? In my situation, I was always a pretty good student. What my teacher did, I think, was he identified that and sort of put me on this path of having him feed me into this concept that I was a special student, and that special students did certain things in sort of the Greek-Roman concept of things, and took me down a path where he had some of his former students or parishioners, I'm not really sure which, because he was a 6th grade teacher who was a former priest. And I think that for me, in terms of the journey, one of the first steps is absolutely beginning to understand that you're not alone, that other people have actually gone through, if not exactly the same kind of things, very similar kind of grooming processes, and that your grooming was very intentional, that it was very methodical, and that it was not out of the ordinary in terms of how these things happen. I started off going to that men's healing group with 8 there's 8 of us in our group, with Jim Struve leading the group. And then after 2 years of that, I went to that weekend recovery, where on the level 1 of that, your first time going, you're put into a small group where they have even more similar experiences than you do in your local groups, because it's a national weekend of recovery with about 50 survivors from all across the country. And they put you in these smaller groups for part of the time, where you share your story with a smaller group of individuals who have gone through much more similar things than you would have had in your smaller local groups, for example. And again, that was another situation where I could see that these kinds of things actually happen to other people, and I was not alone in that. And I also started to do a lot of reading. Some of the great books I read were things like, I think it's called Victims No More by Michael Liu. There was a book, Abused Boys by Mick Hunter, The Courage to Heal by Ellen Bass and Laura Davis. And then my favorite was definitely a book called Instrumental, a memoir of madness, medication, and music by James Rhodes, who's a concert pianist in England. And reading a lot of these things gave me the understanding that what I had experienced was not that uncommon in the world of what those people do.
What was the impact of that realization? All of a sudden, you're making this realization, okay, I'm not alone.
Right.
How does that impact your life? What does that do to the intellect?
Oh, I think it has a dramatic impact in terms of how you perceive what happened to you, because you understand that your reaction to these things was not abnormal. And you understand that your reaction to these things is not something that you should be ashamed of. Sitting down with other people who've gone through similar experiences and having them explain their reactions and having them also express the fact that, well, why didn't I stop this? And they would say, I feel complicit. Why did I like it sometimes? And there's so many different components of why you would like these things sometimes, whether it's the physical and the physiological reactions to things, or whether it's the emotional reaction to being praised and being told how wonderful you are. It's more than just the physiological kind of things as well that you can react to in a way of thinking this is a good thing kind of situation. And so the reaction to sitting down with people and having them explain their perspectives as well is that you realize, you're not alone in feeling those things in terms of the reactions. And that's a great help. One of the other things that I think is so beneficial in terms of going through the therapy, and especially in the group therapy setting, is I was told over and over again by my friends who were further along the path than I was. They'd say, hey, Alan, just sit down with your 11-year-old self. You're now, in your 50s, and you need to sit down with your 11-year-old self and understand that what you're doing right now in terms of placing blame and shame is from the perspective of an adult. And you're trying to apply those ideas on what you should have done from the perspective of an adult and not from the perspective of an 11-year-old child. And so they would say, you got to sit down with yourself and look at your 11-year-old self and just say, hey, of course you weren't complicit. If you were 45 years old and engaging in that kind of situation, yeah, you probably would be considered to be complicit. But your 45-year-old or 55-year-old mind is not the mind that you had when you were 11, and you've got to start remembering that you were 11. And so these conversations and understanding those things are huge in getting to that place where you can feel, as opposed to intellectually understand, where you can actually feel that it's not your fault. And so that age issue is huge in terms of, an adult mind versus an 11-year-old mind, and understanding that, that you can't look back and assess these things as an adult and hold yourself responsible for what you would think now.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's another important part of my journey in terms of the incredible impact of being able to talk about these things and talking to people who've experienced these things, so that you know that they understand you and they understand what you went through. And that's huge. I mean, the fact that it's not your fault come together at some point.
Yeah.
I'm not there yet, but I'll get there one day, hopefully.
I think that's another commonality and help in talking to other people who are on the same healing journey that you are.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing all of this.
Thank you.
We always seem to run out of time.
I know, it's my fault this time, especially.
No, I don't think so.
I got to run to my son's piano recital.
But we are going to meet again soon.
Oh, yeah, we will. We'll continue with this.
Yeah.
Because there's even some more concepts on this before we even go into the other part.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.
We'll talk again.
Okay, thanks.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I want to give a shout out to Alan Manwaring for taking time out of his busy schedule to be on the show with me, and for his insights and fortitude to let us all be a part of his healing journey. Thank you, Alan. It means the world to me. I also want to give the invitation once more to those of you who have been raped or sexually assaulted and are ready to share your story with others in the pursuit of furthering your own healing and providing some guideposts in helping others heal. Just email me at davemarkel@gmail.com. That's DAVEMARKEL @gmail.com. And we'll talk about the possibility of you being on one of my episodes. I again want to give my heartfelt appreciation to you, my listeners, for being with me each week. Your loyalty and willingness to share this podcast with your friends, co-workers, and family is what's causing this podcast to grow, which is what needs to happen in order to bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Also, please remember to start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been affected by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.